Good morning, everybody. Very good to be with you today, and very pleased to be able to do this. This is not your normal lesson. I can promise you that much. It's not the normal lesson in content, and it's not the normal lesson in length. I'm just warning you now. So, but I think it's going to give us some great things to think about. That's really my goal. I'm going to get right into it. The title is "What's Your Story?" And really, if there's a theme for this whole thing, it's the theme of story, for us to be able to connect with the story of what the Bible is talking about. Now, I've got a few assumptions that I'm making about the people here today. I want to let you know what they are. Okay. First of all, my first assumption is that you exist. And that's a fair enough assumption. I hope you agree with that one. If you're struggling at that point, I'm not sure I can help you, okay? But if you think you exist, we're on the right track. The second assumption is that you can think. And you've got the capacity to think and reason. And my third assumption is that you can decide what it is that you think about. And that means that you've got a lot of agency about what it is that drives and shapes your life. And you're not just being carried along necessarily in the current of culture or whatever. You can decide what you think about. So if you're a Christian here today, my message to you is to learn how to tell a better story. Learn how to tell a better story. Become a storyteller. Because Christians can know their chapter and verse, right? Yep. And they're very good at their bullet points, right? Yep. But they don't have any idea about how to communicate the story. Not no idea, but I think we're challenged with that sometimes. And I believe we need to become better storytellers. If you're not a Christian here today, my hope is that you'll catch wind of what I believe is a wonderful story. And that you can go away today with something to really chew on and really think about and really have a look at that story and where it's leading. You know, in many ways, we're all very similar. We have, I believe, very similar needs, with us all being humans. And I want to take a couple of minutes to look at that. So what are our needs? Well, C.S. Lewis, Christian apologist from last century, said, a good life, what's a good life? A good life is like a fleet of ships. Really? How so? Well, what he's saying is a good life means we're rightly related to self. And you can see there's three things here. Rightly related to others and rightly related to our purpose in our end. So rightly related to self. If you're a ship or a fleet of ships, it means that your ship is okay. Your ship shape. Everything on board your ship is working well. Your own life works. Your life works. It's in balance. You can do what you need to do. You're pretty ship shape. That's the first thing you've got to have. The second thing you've got to have is rightly related to others. And you can imagine that ships in a fleet really want to be in good relationship with each other. They really do not want to smash into one another. Not too fast, not too slow. For us, our relationships need to be working well to have a good life. You get along with people. You enjoy your relationships. You are better for them and they are better off having you around. Rightly related to others. And thirdly, we're rightly related to our end, our purpose. Where's my fleet sailing to? And why am I going there? For us, where's my life going exactly? And that can be a pretty big question. Maybe for some of us here today, it's our biggest question. And hopefully the next 30 or a bit more minutes will help us help with that exact question. Moving from ships to life now, we can come up with three things I think we all need as people. Wholeness. This is at an individual level. I'm aligned. I'm being the person I want to be. I live out the qualities I expect of others. What I am publicly is what I am privately. There's wholeness in my life. That's one of the things I think we need for a good life. Secondly, justice. a longing for justice. That's how we relate with others. It's a social component. Because we don't simply live alone, do we? There's other people out there, and how's life going for them? And as we think about our world today, we innately sense that something is not quite right in our world. Despite best efforts sometimes, there always seems to be people who are taken advantage of, who lose out, who are miserable. And the world can be a cold place, and injustice is everywhere. God quite often gets the blame for injustice. There's one thing good about that is that tells me that we're looking for justice. We know somehow it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be unjust. But at the same time, I think we can recognise that the desires in our own hearts that we see that execute injustice on a small scale, you know them, the desire to be in control, the desire to retaliate, the desire to gossip, to betray, to humiliate. If we're honest, we've felt those things in our own hearts at different points in our lives, haven't we? The desire to get ahead, even if it means someone else losing out. And if it's there in our own life, what will it be like on a world scale? It's simply a matter of scale. That's why there's injustice in the world, because there's injustice in me. God's plan is for the church to join with him to bring hope and healing to a broken and hurting world. He wants us to be his partners to do that. Caravan's a bit of that. A little bit of that in a small way, helping meeting the needs of the vulnerable. And that's an important witness to others. And lastly here, significance. We need wholeness, we need justice, we need significance. It's the uncomfortable question we ask sometimes of ourselves when we're alone. Why am I here? What's it all for? What's life all about? Where am I going? And then if we're really honest, we might even ask ourselves, do I even matter? Am I significant at all? Our life needs to count for something, doesn't it? These are big human needs everybody has. And so I think the value that we crave is related to the justice that we seek. And that's one thing we can be as Christians, as kingdom people, meeting the needs of the oppressed and vulnerable. And it does two things. It brings more justice and it shapes our purpose as we do it. So if that's what we all need, is anybody telling that story? And I've got three stories here. Is traditional Christianity telling the story? Is secular world, business world, or the cultural world, the political world, is that telling the story? Or is it something else, perhaps? Might be the story that we need to listen to. Let's take a look at that. So thinking about Christianity, how religious people see it. How do you see it? There's my nice white church. Very peaceful, and you can just imagine there's be nuclear families in their Sunday best turning up to that church, and I've got my nice community and my nice white church building. That's white, the colour, but it also might be the skin colour, but I didn't mean the skin colour, but it could be the, that's kind of a picture of what I'm calling traditional Christianity. Now, that's how Christians might see it. How does everybody else see traditional Christianity? Something like this? What's that look like? Something out of The Walking Dead. It's a dystopian dumpster fire. Christianity, the world thinks, its best days are behind it. It might have been there once, but it's not speaking to me now. And why is that? This kind of thing? Do we see this in churches? Do we see this in traditional Christianity? Religious bigotry, is that a thing? What about financial scams? Have we seen any of those at all? What about sexual abuse? We had a whole royal commission on it. What about control, religious trauma, greed? Christian fascism is something these days. So that's, in many people's heads, that's what Christianity looks like to them. How will you talk to those people? What's wrong with this picture? More Christians. Inviting, isn't it? I think I'd go and have a chat with them. They seem a very safe group. Sometimes that's how Christians communicate. And how do you react when you see that? Do you find yourself running towards it? Or do you find yourself running away from that picture? So, how's the story so far? If we look at the traditional Christianity story in the eyes of the average person. For many people today, the message of Christianity they see here is simply not compelling. It's not attractive. It's not credible for a lot of people. Yet to be fair, how's the world doing? How's the world doing with its message? Let's have a look at that one. How's the world in general doing right now? Kind of the same, right? And the world in general is also a bit of a dumpster fire. Interpersonal communication has become savage. There's rampant domestic violence statistics, constant outrage, weaponized social media. Society's become increasingly tribal. Wars are a constant in our world today. And they've got their own problems. Sectarianism, sexual abuse, same, mental illness, a lot of that. Hate speech, greed, domestic violence, a lot of similar sorts of things in the world story as well. And what's the story that the world is telling? And we'll spend a bit of time thinking about this today. There's some core beliefs that really come out of a secular worldview in our culture today. And the first one, I've just picked a few. And you know these are core beliefs because if you don't go along with any of these, you get hammered, right? Core belief number one, no transcendence allowed. What do I mean by that? No transcendence allowed. It means you can't talk about or have anything that's supernatural, particularly not biblical supernatural. There's no creator, there's no miracles, everything must be described naturalistically. No transcendence. No God in the marketplace. God is unwelcome. He's unwelcome in the boardroom, the bedroom, the courtroom, and the classroom. And even sometimes in many churches, the transcendent God is unwelcome. Number two, identity is socially constructed. And this is a big thing now. This is a lens where individual expression is a response to oppression, majority oppression. In this tale, reality is socially constructed. And you can think of many groups and they identify with their group. And all these different groups are kind of are popping up and are there, and there's sort of, I think it's connected with that search for significance that we talked about earlier. But my identity is something that we construct socially rather than something which is overarching. Third secular thing, truth is relative. There's no such thing as absolute truth, according to this. No one has the right to impose a truth on others, is what it's saying. You have your truth, I have my truth. Let's just all try and get it wrong. And then the last one here, self is at the centre. And here our number one allegiance in this story is to ourselves. Look after number one. My rights, my comfort. I can't really worry too much about you and your needs because I have to take care of myself. It's a very strong current in our society today. So these might be what's going on, but what's the result of these things? So if there's no transcendence, what does that mean? We ended up with disenchantment, a loss of wonder, even a loss of beauty in the world. Is it just everything is naturalistic? Is that it? There's no transcendence? Now, people look for that's why people like to go out to the ocean or go bushwalking or this kind of thing, right? To get something that's a bit transcendent, or look at the stars. You know? We want that. Hope and beauty fade. There's a loss of wonder and awe, and life becomes boring and grey. Identity, socially constructed, leads to competing agendas and division. A lot of our political debate is about this. Relative truth leads to confusion. If we all have our own truths, what happens if they conflict? What happens if my truth conflicts with yours? Which they will. And with self at the centre, you actually end up being empty and disconnected. You think that you're going to make yourself better, but it doesn't end up that way. It's not the answer at all, despite what the advertisers all say. So that's the secular cultural story. What's the third story? What could the third story be? Maybe there's a third story option that speaks to the needs that all of us have and that the whole world has. And I believe it's the gospel story. And the way I want to approach this is to look at what the gospel story is telling us in big pieces. The gospel story here is the story the Bible tells when we view it from start to finish. Not just a few chapters in the New Testament. We're looking at the whole thing from start to finish. Number one, we are made to enjoy and be in close fellowship with God. The Bible tells us that. Read that at the very beginning of the Bible. The Bible speaks of a transcendent yet personal God who wants to dwell with his humans. 2, there's much that separates and alienates mankind from God. The Bible tells us that. There are things in our world which are trying to decreate it, which are trying to separate us. The Bible talks about this in an honest way. And then the rest of the biblical story is God is doing everything he can to get us back. That's the kind of God that he is. We're not forced, however, to respond to that call of his. We have a choice. We don't have to, but he is calling us and he does want us. And he does promise at the end, perfect fulfillment awaits. Promise of a new heaven and a new earth, a life of truth, goodness, and beauty. That's the Bible story from start to finish. And if we understand that story, I believe it's a very compelling story. And if we learn how to tell it, that would be a wonderful thing. So, it takes aim at the narratives in our culture. So instead of no transcendence allowed, the gospel story says, disagree with that, there is a transcendent God. And instead of identity is socially constructed, the gospel story says identity actually comes from God. You don't make it up yourself. And third, instead of saying truth is relative, the Bible says truth is absolute. There is a truth. And fourth, instead of self being at the centre, love is at the centre, and you become last. I'm not going to need a good ad to sell that one, right? But that's what the gospel story says. Love is at the centre, serving others. And it's a story with a main character in it. And that character is Jesus of Nazareth. He lived in the Galilee region in northern Israel most of the time, about 2,000 years ago. He was a man of peace, but with a revolutionary message. And I want to take a look now at one of his claims. What Jesus claimed? He said, I am God. Oh, really? When did he say that? You can probably find books and books of religious study people saying, well, no, Jesus never really claimed that. Well, see what you think when we look at this passage here from the Gospel of John. Jesus is talking and he says, I and the Father are one. Again, his Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, I've shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any good work, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. You, a mere man, claim to be God. His opponents understood it. That was his claim. How do we know that? Well, they tried to kill him for saying it. They were not happy. This is a big claim, by the way, to say I am God. It's a truth claim. And it's either true or it's not true. His contemporaries understood it, and they didn't like it. This guy needs to shut up or die, is what they thought. And that's exactly what happened. Jesus went on to be killed, crucified on a Roman cross, at the behest of the religious leaders of the day. Let's look now, and we'll talk more about that a bit later, but let's look now at how one person told the story. Now we're talking about Paul, the Apostle Paul. So this is a story now about a first century Pharisee. He was a very religious Jewish man, highly educated. And at one point in his life, he thought pleasing God meant killing Christians. And that's what he was trying to do. That was what was driving his life. But Jesus had to talk to him about that direction, and he changed. We've all heard of seeing the light and the Damascus Road experience. That's Paul that we're talking about there. And then, so his life did change, and he left it all behind, all the trappings of what he had before behind now to become a Christian and to preach that story throughout Asia Minor. To all people. Eventually he actually focused mostly on the non-Jewish people. In fact, he went to the Gentiles. And here he is in Athens, which is Gentile city of Gentile city, right? This is the core of Greek culture, of the core of Hellenistic culture. He's there in Athens, and he is talking now, and we're going to go through this passage together. He's talking now to those people who were there at the time. He's at the Areopagus. It's the favourite haunt of the Greek philosophers of the day. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. What was he talking about? Jesus and the resurrection. We'll come back to that. But he's here, he's going everywhere. He's going to the synagogues. He's going to the where the philosophers hang out. And he's talking to them. And they're saying, what's he talking about? It's this Jesus and resurrection thing. Huh? It goes on. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? Sounds very interesting. You can come on my podcast." That's what we do today. "You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. These people were not stuck in their ways. Okay, they loved talking about this kind of stuff. And there's something about what Paul was saying to them that was different. We're hearing your message, Paul. There's something different about it. And they're curious. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Paul's very clever. He did his homework. He did the city tour before he got there. And he walked around and he'd have a look at how do these guys think about things? What's the religious world like for them? And look at their altars and look at their temples. And he spotted this one here which said altar to an unknown God. Oh, that tells me something. he says, you're covering your bases. And it also tells me that there's something that you don't know about. And I'm going to tell you what that is. I'm going to get in there and reveal to you what it is that you don't know. Interesting comment about being religious and ignorant, isn't it? Just notice that. So Paul starts telling them what it is that they don't know. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. This God I'm talking about, he says, is very different to all your other gods. He's transcendent. He doesn't need a man-made temple. He's not confined there. He's too big for that. And he doesn't need people to feed him or to take care of him like the pantheon. It's the other way around, in fact. This God gives life and gives everything else. Paul is breaking all the cultural rules, supernatural and transcendent. He's the source of life rather than being kept alive by humans. Very non-naturalistic, but also very different to how gods operate for these people. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him, perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. This is a creating and organised God, and he wants to be found by us. He's transcendent, but he's also immanent, which means he's close and findable. Transcendent and immanent. That's the God the Bible is talking about. The transcendence that we crave and the immanence that we need. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Paul here is making use, this is how Paul's telling the story. We can learn from this. He's making use of their culture, isn't he? He says some of your own poets have said these things. So us too, we can make use of our culture. Our culture does contain good things and even some truth. But when it comes to matters of religious faith, cultural interests end up calling the shots on that. What Paul is doing here is helping them to reimagine their understanding of the spiritual world. And that's the same for us. We need to reimagine. We need to help people reimagine their concept of God. God's looking for a response. It says here, he wants to turn our head and turn our hearts and decide to take another look. He drops the R-bomb. He commands all people everywhere to repent. Yes, that's part of the gospel story, but not the first word. Okay, don't start with that. He's giving them, he's helping them to see that they're missing something. And this is where to turn. God is serious. And he's set a day. He has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. But others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. God is serious and he wants to bring justice to the world, as we talked about earlier. And he's going to do this through the resurrected man, Jesus. This is another R-bomb. Resurrection. Bit non-transcendent, isn't it? And people are saying, okay, Paul, let me read it back to you, Paul. Paul, you're asking us to believe in a bodily resurrection from the dead. Is that what you're saying? Yes. Yes, it is. It does a number of things. It fulfills our desire for justice, and it's a proof claim. He has appointed, he has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And now we're talking about the resurrection here, and you've got two responses. It was a divisive issue then. It's a divisive issue now. Some of them sneered. You have got to be kidding me, Paul. You've got to be kidding me. But some of them were curious. It's the core teaching Christianity. So which side do we come down on? Are we sneering at that claim, or we are curious about that claim? And then the last thing I notice about Paul is he does know when to stop talking, and he left. Okay. So it comes down to this one key evidential issue: resurrection. That's the core of the gospel. The whole of Christianity rests in this one historical event. That's our claim. Let's read from 1 Corinthians 15. But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there's no resurrection from the dead? Paul's writing to Christians here. We're getting a bit confused. If there's no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised by logic. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. But he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. If the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins, then those who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we of all people are most to be pitied. Did you catch that? Did you catch what Paul was saying there? He says basically, if there's no resurrection of Jesus, there is no Christianity. He's saying, if there's no resurrection, well, it makes all Christians liars because they never stop talking about it. And if there's no resurrection, it makes Christians pitiful for throwing your life away on a lie. And if there's no resurrection, you go home now. Pick up a cake on the way out. You know, and this is very important for Christianity because people are confused about it sometimes. They want the Christianity, or maybe there's some nice things in Christianity, maybe, but no resurrection, please. And it's a stunning admission, isn't it? Paul's just writing 20 years after Jesus' death here, and burial and resurrection. He says if there's no resurrection, there's no Christianity. The teachings fall to the ground. The tradition falls to the ground. Everything falls to the ground. And not only that, we're pitiful, foolish, misguided liars. So it's a pretty important thing, right? So I want to take a little look now at the resurrection. There's two corollaries. The resurrection of Jesus is crucial to how the gospel works. And secondly, Christianity as religion cannot survive on the teachings of Jesus or any tradition or any custom without the resurrection. Those are two important corollaries. So did the resurrection happen? Let's have a look. Pontius Pilate. He was the guy who sentenced Jesus to be crucified on the cross at the very first Easter. And, let's start there. Did he exist? Was this a made-up guy? Well, until 1961, you might have argued the toss, but then they found a stone with his name carved on it at Caesarea. A 2 by 3 foot Latin inscription. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has presented the Tiberium to the Caesareans. So that was his name. He presented something to them when he went to visit there in Caesarea, and he was, guess what? He was the prefect of Judea, the procurator, 26 to 36 AD. Pilate was a historical figure. So now outside the Bible we have a reference to him as an historical person. What about crucifixion? Is that a thing? Did that really happen? A lot in history. Cicero, famous orator, lived 106 to 46 BC, called death by crucifixion in his writings, this is before Jesus, the most cruel and hideous of tortures. Just over 30 years before Jesus, there was an uprising of Jews, and the governor of Syria crucified 2,000 Jews. That's an historical fact. While working in Jerusalem, construction workers uncovered an ancient tomb. Inside the tomb they found a nail in knotted wood piercing through an ankle bone. And that's what we're seeing here. That's what they found. That's what it kind of looks like when you clean it up a bit. It's an exhibit. That's the real one over there. And so this is a 1968 discovery, and it's been dated to the 1st century. Yes, they crucified people and put nails through people's feet. There's actual hard evidence of that fact. Plus many other writers mention Jesus' crucifixion, not just the Bible. The Jewish historian Josephus, the Greek writer Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar Serapion, it's in the Jewish Talmud. Josephus said, Christ was crucified on the pretext that he'd instigated rebellion against Rome on a par with zealots and other political activists. There's some dispute about some of Josephus' writing, but that much is fair. Crucifixion was a thing. Let's think about the resurrection story in general. There's a few odd things about it. In the Jewish culture, being hung on a tree was a curse, not a good thing. Deuteronomy, it says, if someone guilty of a capital offence is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it the same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land your Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. In the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 21. New Testament teaches Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. He quotes that actual verse. Now let's say you want to start a new movement amongst the Jews. Would your starting point really be something happened to our leader, which is a curse? Would you start there? Would you really start with that idea if you're making it up? No. You need to get better political advisors, okay, if that's the way that you think. What about this? When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others, the 11 disciples of Jesus that were still living. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. The first witnesses to the empty tomb, so Jesus was died, buried, put into this tomb. And the Bible teaches he was raised in what we call the resurrection. And so if you go to that tomb, he's not going to be there. And that's what happened on the day after the Sabbath. These women went to the tomb and found that he wasn't there. They weren't expecting that. And then they told the apostles, he's gone, he's not there. And this is recorded for us in the gospel accounts that the first witnesses were women. If you were up in a court in the 1st century and you wanted to prove your innocence, you would not call a woman as a witness. Why? Sorry, women. That's the way that it was. Believe it or not, in some places, at some times, this world has been a patriarchy. That may surprise you, but it was like that then, okay? Yes, the testimony of a woman was not trusted in the culture. So if you were making this up, you wouldn't put that in your story. You need better political advisors if that's going to be the way you write your story. Unless, of course, it actually happened that way. It's an odd thing. If no resurrection, well, then we just have a crucifixion, which is a pretty degrading, horrible way to go. So where did the Christian idea of this risen Saviour come from if there's no resurrection? If Jesus claimed messiahship before the cross, how could that reputation persist afterwards? He died. Surely that would be the end of the road. But it did persist. The fact that you're here today proves that. How could so many people, including his disciples, suffer humiliation, torture, suffering and death if they knew the resurrection? The core doctrine they promoted was false. And to my mind, this is the real clincher. Unless you renounce that Jesus was raised from the dead, we're going to torture you and kill you. Oh yeah, sorry, I was only joking. Don't torture me, don't kill me. Now I'm going to go through with it. Why? Because I know it's wrong. I know it never happened. I don't think many people would do that. But a lot of people did hang on to these truths in the face of a lot of suffering, torture and death, including his followers, immediate followers. Two-stage resurrection theology came out of nowhere if there was no resurrection. Jesus, there's a resurrection from the dead that the New Testament goes on to teach about. Where would that come from if there was no resurrection? So if you put all these things together, all the little historical things, all the storytelling things, just thinking through, well, how would this movement of Christians even get off the ground if there was no resurrection? It's kind of hard to see how that would all work unless there actually was a resurrection. Now we know most of this from the Bible, and whoops, that slide messed up. In the top part of that slide is a table of ancient texts. When they were written, who wrote them, how many copies there are, and when the earliest versions that we have today are available. And one of them I can remember. We've all heard of the Greek poet Homer. So he wrote a very famous epic poem called the Iliad in 643 BC. The earliest copies we have of that is something like 1100. No, sorry, the earliest copies we have of that are something like 1,000 years later than when he wrote it. The earliest copies. And how many have we got? Sorry, there was 643 copies is what we've got. And he wrote it in probably some centuries BC, excuse my fragility on that. So we have 643 copies and about 1,000-year gap between when he wrote it and our earliest copy. There's a number of other writers like that as well. How does that stack up against the biblical texts? So instead of 643 manuscripts, how many do we have of the New Testament? We have 5,000 Greek manuscripts and about 40,000 or more in all languages, plus lectionary readings. We have complete bound copies. You can go to the British Library and see them from the early 4th century. That's only a few hundred years after these books were written. And there's a manuscript you can go to Manchester and see called the Rylands fragment, P52, piece of papyrus, dated to 125 AD from the Gospel of John. Maybe only 30 or so years after he actually wrote it. And so what we've got in terms of manuscripts of the Bible is something which is just so far away, incredible compared to any other ancient text. And if you really want to get into it, you can compare and contrast all the different texts from all the different places and all the different times, and you'd be stunned at how close they are. And there's people who devote their lives to this, and if you really want to get into it, you can buy an SBL Greek New Testament, and all the little footnotes are there about what was in what version and all the rest of it. It's done very, very seriously. It is a highly accurate text in the New Testament. And that's good, and that's great, but I've got a question. One question. What's your question? So what? So what? So you've got a pretty accurate text. You've got a book that's pretty accurate. That's what the evidences and all the manuscripts give us, right? The understanding that's pretty accurate in terms of transmission. But here's me. Got some facts there. Cool. I've got textbooks from uni that are pretty accurate. Okay. I need more than that. If I'm looking, I want something a bit more than just accuracy. We need these things we were talking about before. It's nice to know that it's accurate, but we need to know that we're worth something. And this ultimately is what the biblical message is all about. The gospel and the biblical account affirms that you are worth something. Because that is why Jesus did what he did on that cross. And we need to learn and understand the story of the Bible, what that says about God and how we fit into that story. That's what we need over and above the facts. So just to close off on this, I want to tell a story and show you two different ways of relating the facts. Because hopefully what we can do here is we can learn how story works. And I hope you can hear and feel the difference. So this is for the Christians in the room primarily, to educate us in storytelling. So here's our example. The Sabbath. You've heard of the Sabbath, right? So it's the day of rest, the holy day of rest. And there's two approaches that we could look at to talk about the Sabbath. Here's approach number one. This is what I call the Bible facts approach. Bible as reference book approach. Bullet point approach, if you like. Approach number one, information, rules and regs. You shall observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. There's the verse. That's the one in Exodus. There's another one in Deuteronomy. And what do we get from that is that you'll observe the Sabbath. You're not allowed to do any work on the Sabbath. You must keep it holy, right there in the Ten Commandments. And of course what happened is, over time, a whole set of religious traditions built up and accrued around this verse. Because then the question comes up, well, hang on. So what does it mean exactly? What does it mean exactly to observe the Sabbath? And how can I be sure that I'm keeping it holy? Where is the boundary? Where's the boundary line? I need to know that. What was work and what wasn't work? And in some circles, religious circles, this actually became the main game. Is this defining? And in fact, Jesus had a number of run-ins with the religious leaders on this exact point. In one account, in Luke's Gospel, he healed a woman who'd been bent over and crippled for 18 years. 18 years, she could not even stand up straight. And bent over, it might have been down here. Can you imagine living like that for 18 years? And Jesus healed her on this particular day, and she was ecstatic. And the religious leader standing nearby said, he saw this and he criticised Jesus for doing work on the Sabbath. You should have waited until tomorrow, Jesus. So how did Jesus answer him? He said, you hypocrite. You complete hypocrite. You got an ox or a donkey at home? So it's tied up, right? It's tied up in the stall. And what do you do on the Sabbath? You go to that ox or that donkey and you untie it and you release it and you lead it so it can have a drink of water. That's what you do today for your ox or your donkey. And here me, I am untying a daughter of Abraham who's been tied up for 18 years in suffering and bondage, and you criticize me, you hypocrites. See what Bible as reference book can do to you? You don't see the big picture. You don't tie it in with God's overall story of redemption. You just see it as your set of rules that you need to enforce. So I think it's time to learn a new way of communicating. And let's look at an alternative approach. And we'll be finishing here. Understanding the story. Understanding the story. So what we need to do here, it's the same topic, we're talking about the Sabbath, but now let's communicate it as a story. Let's go back. So before Moses even gave these 10 commandments, what had the people been doing? They'd been oppressed as forced labour slaves in Egypt for 400 years, making bricks under watchful slave masters as forced labourers, building store cities for pharaohs. And they will work ruthlessly. And you know how this goes in that kind of culture. Your life is measured by how many bricks you make. You are a unit of production. And there's quotas for that. Better keep up. That's what life was like for the Hebrews in Egypt. Then God rescues them from their slavery. It's the great salvation event in the Old Testament. The great salvation event of the Exodus. And the people escaped from Egypt and they got their freedom. And a bit while later, God calls Moses and he comes down the mountain with the 10 Commandments. You've seen the movie, right? And what do they say? You can imagine being there on that day. There's Moses with the 10 Commandments. And so I'd like to go over and have a look at what's written there. Okay, so let me see. First one, what's the first one? It says, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an image or bow down. Yes, that's good. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Yep. Okay, now what's this fourth one? What's this fourth one say? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Hang on a sec. Does that mean what I think it means? Hey, Martha, guess what? It says here we get to have a day off every week. We get to have a day off every week. I can't believe it. A day off. That's unbelievable. You mean that my worth to this God is not tied to my ability to produce anything? Do you see the difference? Do you see the difference? When you see the story, rather than just the facts, and you tie it in to what God is wanting to do in this world, it hits you very differently, doesn't it? It's very compelling. And that's right, Martha, because your worth comes from being created in the very image of God himself. In this story, God is rescuing and redeeming his people. He wants to put the world back together. And he's looking for partners to help him do just that. That is meaningful work. And sometimes we can feel like a pretty small cog in a pretty big machine because our value, we feel, is tied to our production. But God wants to give us more than that. And this is really what the gospel story is all about. God is putting the world back together, and he wants you and me as his redeemed and worthy partners to do it with him. That's wholeness. That bends towards justice. That's significance, and that's the core of the story. So, which story will you listen to? No gospel, there's no transcendence allowed. Gospel saying transcendence is totally allowed. We get transcendence, we get God, we get awe. Wonder. No gospel, identity is socially constructed. With the gospel, your very personhood is coming from God. It's a story where instead of truth being relative, truth is clear and unchanging. And it's a story where instead of just having ourselves at the centre, you get to be a partner with God as a servant of others in God's great project to put the world back together. And so I hope you've got something to think about here this morning. I thank you for listening. And like Paul in Athens, it's time for me to stop talking. What's your story? Thank you very much.